Joining us now on the show, very pleased to welcome Rustin Dodd, senior writer at The Athletic. Previously, you know him from his work as a sports writer at the Kansas City Star from 2010 to 2017. And I, before that, knew him from forging a legendary career as the sports director at University of Kansas Student Run Radio 90.7 KJHK. Rustin, how the heck are you, man?
I'm good, and yeah, our KJHK days are legendary. So thank you for bringing that up too.
Shout out to co-author for you, Mark Dent, and all of our KJHK buddies out there. It was good times.
Yeah, for sure.
So we have Rustin here to talk about his book, his and Mark Dent's book, I should say, coming out, Kingdom Quarterback, Patrick Mahomes, the Kansas City Chiefs, and how a once-swinging cowtown chased the ultimate comeback, releasing August 22nd, published by Dutton Books, available at Kingdom Random House, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. If you are an audiobook listener like me, you can get it on Audible if you've got your Audible subscription. So Rustin, tell us about the book.
Well, again, thanks for having me. So yeah, it comes out August 22nd, but I guess I'll just like start with the quick background of the story on like how it came to be. So Mark and I are both originally from Overland Park. Grew up there in the 90s. We're both like in our mid to late 30s. I think we're all kind of the same age on this show right now. So, we grew up in Kansas City at a time where it felt like, I don't know, I guess I was doing this other interview the other day and I was like, what did people say about like Kansas City in the 90s? Like if you grew up around then, like what was kind of like it known for? And like it was, everybody would always say like, well, it's a great place to grow up, it's like a great place to live, and like even like suburbs and stuff would always be on these lists of like, oh, it's the top 10 suburb in the country or whatever. Anyway, so that was like sort of Mark and I's experience growing up. Then we met at the KU journalism school. We both went into journalism. We both been kind of journalists or sports writers in some form or another for like the last decade or plus. And so Mark, he was living in Dallas at the time. I was living in New York, and this was in 2020. So the Chiefs had won the Super Bowl. They were kind of cruising, through that follow-up season, like kind of the run it back season. And I guess like it was, that season was kind of strange. I might be misremembering, but like they were winning every game, but they weren't like blowing teams out. But anyways, they were almost like winning every single game. They probably would have gone 15-1 if they didn't rest their, starters the last game of the season. And it just like really seemed like, wow, they're going to win back-to-back Super Bowls. Like,
Sure.
they're going to do it. Like it seemed very likely. And at that point, and really still to this point, like Patrick Mahomes had just never really disappointed anybody. So it seemed like, okay, they're going to win back-to-back Super Bowls. And Mark, anyway, to make a long story short, just kind of came to me and was like, we should, write a book about Kansas City, because not only are they, on the cusp of a NFL dynasty and this totally, transformational figure in football and Patrick Mahomes, but, we had also just kind of seen like Kansas City sort of develop over the last like 20 to 25 years and really sort of have this sort of kind of renaissance where, a lot of that's, based on sports. So somebody might debate like, okay, is it really a renaissance? Who is it a renaissance for? Like whatever. But like, obviously, downtown had really come back in like the mid 2000s. And, then there was just all this sort of new energy around Kansas City, people wearing like Kansas City t-shirts and stuff. And I know that's a little bit cliche, but like, it's just like, even living in New York City, I walk around and like, I see more Kansas City t-shirts than I would ever see of like Milwaukee or Cincinnati or, Buffalo
Sure.
or like, and I know I noticed that stuff because where I'm from, but there really is something true about that. Like if you're in an airport, like people are wearing Kansas City stuff. You don't see a lot of like Salt Lake City t-shirts, Anyway, so to make this whole long story short, Mark was like, we should really write a book about Kansas City, and we should write, but make it sort of half about Kansas City and half about Mahomes. And so then we kind of realized if we were going to do that, we really needed to kind of tell the history of Kansas City. So that project kind of got put on the back burner when the Chiefs lost the Super Bowl. But then we picked it up back up kind of during the next summer, and then into that season, which ultimately ended with the Bengals loss in the AFC title game. But that was when we sort of kind of put together a book proposal and pitched it to publishers and really kind of fine-tune what we wanted to do, which was sort of tell two stories at once, which was kind of the history of Kansas City, and then kind of next to sort of the rise of Patrick Mahomes and just sort of what he means, for football, for Kansas City, for, the quarterback position, kind of all of those like questions, I guess, that we all kind of think about all the time now that we're kind of fortunate to like watch this guy play football. And so that is the kind of the basic premise of the book. It's sort of two stories in one, and they sort of tie together in moments in the book, and then but it's also just sort of kind of a both sort of an exploration and kind of a celebration of like all things Kansas City.
So I love that this book is about my favorite person, Patrick Mahomes, and we will of course get to him and talk about him. But I want to start with my favorite place, Kansas City, and I feel really connected to everything that you just said, because I grew up in Kansas City in the suburbs in the 90s, and now I live in Colorado, and I see Kansas City stuff, not just Chiefs stuff, but Kansas City stuff around all the time. And I just loved the first chapter of your book. The prologue is called The Kansas City Spirit, and it really goes back to the story behind the Liberty Memorial and Kansas City raising, I think it was $2.5 million to build this giant civic monument. And it's so interesting to me what you and Mark have done tracing the history back, because I think there really is something to that. Maybe this is because we're all Kansas Cityans here, but to that, I don't know, civic pride. People from Kansas City love Kansas City, and they love talking about being from Kansas City, and it really is their favorite thing and their favorite place. So you tell a really, the history of Kansas City, but I think an important part of that, not just the rise of Kansas City, but then the fall of Kansas City and sort of the re-rise of Kansas City. What was it about your and Mark's experience, I guess, growing up in the suburbs and eventually moving away, that made you want to kind of tackle some of the more difficult parts of the history of Kansas City?
Yeah, well, I think there were two things. So one, you mentioned like, the Liberty Memorial story, and that's a great story. And it's like, Kansas City is like the place where people are really proud of it, and they want to be proud of it, and they want to tell people about it, like you said. But it's also kind of a place that's like always like really striving. Like it's always like kind of striving to get in that next tier of cities. Sure. And it's kind of funny because it still is doing that, kind of now. And, it always sort of wants to think of itself as, like it's a major league city, has the best football team like in the world, and it has all these amazing things, but it's always like feels like, well, it's not this place or it's not that place. And it's like kind of a place that's always sort of striving to the next thing. But it's like fascinating if you actually kind of just read the history. It was always kind of like that, like in the people who lived in Kansas City in like the late 1800s and early 1900s, like they like had so many like dreams for Kansas City. They thought it could be sort of this like inland capital. They thought it could be like the next great American city. Like they just like had all these like sort of civic boosters who really believed in the city. And so we kind of tell that story, and, like there's no reason that Kansas City should be like there's a massive city in the middle of the country. Like it's well situated. It's on a couple of rivers, and like, yeah, it's like if you're transporting goods from like Chicago to Texas or out to the West, like it makes sense that I guess there's like a city kind of in the middle, but like there's no particular reason why it happened to be Kansas City other than like the people who kind of founded the city and then lived there, like really pushed it. But then the second part of your question was like, we really kind of tell the story of J.C. Nichols in the book. And part of that was, where we grew up in the suburbs, all of these just like kind of amazing neighborhoods and Prairie Village. And it's like quintessential suburban America. And I think there's two things about this. I think people in Kansas City don't quite realize how influential J.C. Nichols was nationally in terms of sort of exporting his ideas to like other cities. Like when people talk about like what the suburbs are and what they look like and how, they're developed and shaped and stuff. Like, he wasn't the only one doing this, but he was one of the most prominent developers of the early 20th century in the entire United States. And we sort of document this in the ways in which he sort of influenced cities across America. And it also just so happened that as we were kind of formulating the idea for the book, there was a big fight over kind of his legacy. And, they took the name off the fountain on the plaza in 2020 that had been kind of growing. And, it's like when I was growing up, I didn't really know much about JC Nichols other than like I knew the name, and it's like, oh, I think that guy, like he's on a sign in Furry Village because like I think he developed that. Yeah. And then so that sort of changed in the last 10 years as sort of the legacy was kind of reconsidered and stories were being told. But I was still kind of like just curious because like you sort of knew the basic notes, like you sort of were like, oh, they developed these sort of neighborhoods and then they were like segregated and then like, and there were always like these kind of, it was, you'd read a paragraph where it would describe the history and it always was like, okay, I sort of get it, but feels kind of complicated. And I guess partly we were just sort of motivated to kind of tell that whole story in a way that like people could understand and like might actually, I mean, it was probably selfish reasons too. So it's just so we could kind of understand the actual history, what happened, how did it happen, that kind of stuff. And I just felt like I could never find a thing that could really explain it in a way that I was like, oh, okay, I get it. I mean, you saw the broad strokes and you knew that, but that was those were like kind of the two motivations, just kind of exploring kind of the place we grew up and then also trying to like actually, write the history in a way that like would be kind of interesting and fun. Fun's a weird word to use for this, but just like enjoyable to read, I guess, fun to read. But also in a way that like people would feel like, oh, okay, like this, I get this now.
Well, I'm glad you said that because I think again, like that was something that I don't think I really wrestled with or even really was necessarily aware of until as an adult, when I met my wife, who's not from Kansas City but was very interested in the history of the city, kind of doing some of that research on her own and calling my attention to a lot of things, like why didn't we have a streetcar for 8 decades after we used to have great public transportation in the city, and all these things that all these modern issues that Kansas Cityans face. I think a lot of that goes back obviously to JC Nichols, and I mean those problems exist across the country. So it was a fascinating story and a really fascinating story to have paired with the story of Patrick Mahomes. So obviously, it sounds like you and Mark had this idea, that you were banding about 3 or 4 years ago. But what made you decide to pair those two stories together?
Well, I guess, I mean, the JC Nichols thing came about because I think there was so much energy about it in 2020 as we were kind of, coming up with the idea for the book. It was really that we just wanted to tell the full history of Kansas City. Sure. And he happens to just be a big chunk of that. So, I don't know what percentage of the book is really like about him. It's probably only like 20 or 30%, but it just seemed like a big through line of if you want to explain the Kansas City's history, you really got to make him a character. And that was sort of the motivation. We just sort of wanted to tell these two stories next to each other, sort of Patrick Mahomes representing kind of this new Kansas City and, next to it, kind of telling the full history of how the town was founded, how it was developed, what it was like in the early days, and then sort of, through I guess the 20th century. And, it's like, it also is just the case that, it's like, this is my opinion. I guess I could be wrong, but it's like, sometimes you read a sports book, it's about, a season or a team or whatever. And it's fine or whatever. And sometimes you read a history book and you're like, well, this is kind of boring.
Sure.
Yeah. And you're like, well, I don't want to read, 300 pages about the history of Kansas City that, but if you, are splitting up a chapter of history with a chapter about football that comes after it, it might kind of help kind of pull people through the story a little bit. Like it might just be kind of fun because you know, it's not like a heavy book where it's 300 pages of heavy material. It's, you know, 10 or 15 pages that might make people think about something interesting. And then it's 10 or 15 pages of like jet chip wasp. So like that was also just like we kind of intentionally did that, just sort of trying to make it a book that would feel like meaningful, but also like ultimately, you know, you want people to read it and you want people to finish it. So we also just kind of wanted to make the book like fun. So that's, you know, I mean, is like there's like the thing about Patrick Mahomes too is, I mean, you can say so many things about him, but like ultimately he is incredibly fun.
Yes.
Like, yeah, I mean, he's probably the most like fun person to watch in sports right now. He's probably the most fun athlete I've ever seen. You know, it's like people love watching him, whether they're from Kansas City or anywhere. And you know, it's funny, not to get off track here, but I occasionally will be like out in New York, like at a doctor's appointment or, you know, talking to like a waiter or whatever, and it'll like come up where I'm from or like where I'm from, and I'll say, oh, I'm from Kansas City. And they will ultimately, like the first thing they will usually bring up is like, oh, like the Chiefs, Patrick Mahomes or whatever. And but what's funny about it is like I think there is like a tendency for Kansas Cityans to be a little defensive about Patrick Mahomes, that it's like, but you don't understand how good he is, you know. Like, yeah, it's
sure.
like but which may be true to some degree because maybe he's still underappreciated in ways, but it's like every single conversation I have, people are just like, man, he is incredible. Like he's like, well, man, like he's like the greatest quarterback of all time, huh? And these are like, you know, random people from like Jersey or, you know, like a doctor from, you know, like China or something. So I always find that funny because I think there is a tendency for people to be a little defensive about it, but like I really think even if he's a little underappreciated, that people don't quite realize to the level at which he is so much better than the other quarterbacks. Like I think there's a general, you know, like people understand like this guy is one of one.
So let's talk about Patrick. And I guess this is maybe a good follow-up question to kind of your experiences, you know, in another city, and New York of all places, you know, a coastal city, one of the great cities of America by all accounts. People asking about Kansas City and knowing about Kansas City and tracing that back to Patrick Mahomes. So taking my Chiefs / Patrick Mahomes hat off for a second, he's only 5 years into his career. And we obviously, as Chiefs fans, see him as an inevitable GOAT on par with Michael Jordan and Tom Brady and Wayne Gretzky and with whoever. You know, I mean, the greatest sports figures of all time in the world. We already see him ascending to that level. But for people that are, I mean, your average New Yorker, I mean, have any of them asked you, have you had to defend the fact that you're writing a book about him 5 years into his career? Do people push back against that idea? Because obviously, Chiefs fans are not going to do that. We love it. I mean, we would have read this book in 2020 and it wouldn't have been premature, right? Like when you were first considering the idea, we would have said, oh, yeah, it's time for a book about Patrick Mahomes. 100%. Absolutely. But do you have to defend that decision at all?
You know, well, I mean, like narratively speaking, the second Super Bowl, I feel like was like the clincher of
sure
that. I mean, nobody can really say anything. I mean, I think for like the narrative of his career, like he needed a second Super Bowl and he got it in his fifth season starting. And I think that really cemented him as, you know, the quarterback of his generation. And he was anyways, but like now there's nothing anybody can say. And so I think, yeah, I mean, we obviously, the book was well timed because we knew it was going to come out after this past season. And, you know, like as a journalist, although I grew up in Kansas City and, you know, I grew up like a Chiefs and Royals fan, but like you always kind of, some of the fandom kind of gets beaten out of you and you really are kind of rooting for the story. And you don't care about his results as much, but like, just like full disclosure, like I have never cared more about a result than like this past Super Bowl. This is like our book. We basically were done with it, but we had like the final like chapter and a half or final couple of chapters to write after the Super Bowl, and so I was like, I could not have been happier when they won. So, but I think to bring it back to your question, like, no, I think people sort of understand, and I think like, you know, I think a lot about Patrick Mahomes' career, like where does he go from here, and like he's going to have like if not all of the passing records, he's going to have the majority of them at some point. Um, and so I think it really just comes down to, I guess there's two things. He's likely going to have all of the passing records. I think it really comes down to sort of like longevity and sort of that second career, like that second post prime that he might have. And he's nowhere like near that at this point, but like, in 4 to 5 years, he'll have to sort of kind of reinvent himself a little bit when his body slows down a little bit. But he's also the best, pocket passer in the NFL. So I think
he'll be fine.
Yeah, he's going to do that. So there's the question of like longevity, how long is his peak, but he's going to have all of the passing records or most of them, and then it really comes down to kind of championships. And I kind of always feel these conversations are kind of lame, but there is something to them. And so will he win 4 Super Bowls, or 5, or or more? I guess if I was, you didn't even ask this question, so I don't know exactly.
We're going to
at this point, but like if I was a betting man, I think I would take the over on 4.5, but I think that's probably about where you need to set it. And maybe the over really should be just like 4. But if he gets to 4 Super Bowls, and he owns all the records, he'll have an argument as the greatest quarterback of all time. But maybe he, I mean, it sounds a little greedy, but maybe he needs more Super Bowls. I don't know. But he certainly is on a trajectory to be the best ever. And actually, I don't think anybody's ever played the position better than he has, like at a moment in time, than him. I think the only other one that in my opinion, the only person who's ever played the position at the same kind of level is Aaron Rodgers. And he doesn't have the rings, and but I mean his peak, his sort of prime, I mean if you look at his passer rating numbers are insane, like from those sort of peak years.
Oh, definitely, yeah. And he looked, I mean, like that's who
Mahomes looks like.
That's who he looks like. Right, exactly. I think interesting in terms of his style of play. But let me ask you about that, because I think one of the things that, not that this was necessarily breaking new ground, but here we are talking about Patrick Mahomes potentially being the best quarterback of all time. Certainly at this point, like I think it's hard at this point to make an argument that he's not already in the top 4. I mean, after Brady, obviously Montana and Peyton Manning, and aside from those 3, I mean, he either has, in terms of achievements or just the peak, the 5-year peak, which happens to be his first 5 years starting in the NFL. Who knows? This could be, he maybe hasn't even begun to peak at this point. but I was sort of struck by, and I'd be curious to hear you talk about this part of the book. We get a pretty comprehensive history of his childhood, and obviously he was the son of a major league pitcher. We know that. So he had, I feel like in 2023, it was kind of hard for me to wrap my brain around how he was not a bigger deal as a football player. And I don't know if it's because, you give a couple of different possible explanations. One, East Texas is kind of its own world. 2, obviously, everybody kind of expected him to be a baseball player. But it kind of blew my mind how under the radar possibly the best quarterback of all time was as a football player in high school.
Yeah, I mean, some of these stories are well known, but we write about how, he wasn't a full-time quarterback until midway through his junior year of high school. We have a story in the book that Pat Sr. talks about and told us about was, he was like I might have the term wrong, but he was like an all-conference safety as a sophomore at
Yep.
White House High School, or all district, or whatever, whatever that would be. And so he went to the University of Texas, camp the following kind of spring, I guess. So like the spring of, his sophomore year, he goes to the University of Texas camp. And it's kind of like, the first moment where they bring all the kids who are like, might be good enough to play at Texas. And, they're starting the recruitment process. And they put Patrick with the safeties. And he, at that point, he hadn't played a lot of quarterback, but he played it for like the JV, and, he liked quarterback. And so Pat Sr. told us he was just like, Patrick didn't even really like playing safety. He did it because, they asked him to do it. But like the University of Texas had just no conception of him being a quarterback. So the story goes that they asked, can you put him with the quarterbacks? And anyway, long story short, Patrick end up leaving the camp early and driving back to White House, and they have a conversation where, Pat's just like, maybe you like, he loved basketball obviously too. So he's like, maybe just you need to focus on baseball. Like, maybe that's the future. I think Pat always sort of thought that would be the future anyways. And really the only thing that kept Patrick playing football was that he, like, all of his friends played football. And so he loved playing basketball with his friends. He loved playing baseball with his friends. And he couldn't imagine just like not being out there with his friends on Friday nights. So he goes, back out the next year and ends up winning the quarterback position, or the quarterback job. And, sort of the rest is history. But, Sonny Cumbie, the, former Texas Tech quarterback, who then was a Texas Tech assistant and recruited Patrick, he went and saw him play the first game he ever started. And it was like a driving rainstorm. And, his argument was just sort of that, Big 12 schools, that caliber, like they get kind of locked into the guys who are, the elite quarterbacks, by the time they're a sophomore or junior, it's sort of like we got our guy kind of situation.
Sure.
And so there was that. And he played the other sports. So he didn't go to the kind of elite 11 quarterback camps and the other like offseason camps. He was busy kind of playing other sports. And so I don't know. I think there's like sort of a lesson there too, that just all of those other sports, I mean, you can see it when he plays, and it's a common story, but like you really can't see it. And it's not just the baseball aspect of his game, which is obvious when you look at his arm and the way it works and the throws he makes and the accuracy he has. I mean, you can totally see the baseball influence, but I sometimes see when he's like scrambling around, the vision he has for the field. Like I see a basketball player who is like who his imagination, because like, football, there's improvisation in football at the quarterback position, but football is generally like, okay, you run your route, you do this, like this is your assignment on this play, this is what you do. Basketball is a sport in which you go up and down and it's different every time, and you have imagination and improvisation, and you react and do all these sort of things. And when Patrick is scrambling around, I kind of see the basketball influence almost just as much as the baseball. And so I don't know, I think he's just a guy that sort of played all three sports, and I think he was better for it. And there's another story in the book too that I haven't seen him many places, but when he was like in 8th grade, this White House kind of assistant coach, kind of White House football assistant coach, kind of started tutoring the incoming, who were going to be like soon to be high schoolers, on how to play quarterback. And so,
sure, like a quarterback boot camp for the incoming guys.
Yeah, like he wants to, like, it's Texas sports, so it's like kind of It's kind of crazy. It's like, they're scouting the eighth graders, like, all right, who are the quarterbacks? Who are the good athletes? Like, who or whatever. So like they took them through this sort of like, this sort of boot camp kind of situation where they would go over the terminology for like the White House program and, tell them all what the plays were and what the offense was. And they also just did some throwing. And, this coach, his name was Reno Moore. He watched Patrick throw and he was like, man, he's got something, but like his arm's kind of low. Like, he's kind of like, a little like 3/4. And so he like kind of told him like, all right, like this is good, but like, you got to get this arm up a little bit. And he just kind of kept saying that to him, like, all right, you got to get your arm up a little bit. And then finally he saw him play and just sort of realized like, not only did he not need to get his arm up, but like, it wasn't just that his arm was 3/4. It was almost like it would change based on the actual throw he was making. Sometimes it would be a little higher, sometimes it'd be a little lower. And he realized like, wow, this kid can be incredibly accurate from all of these different arm angles. And he's never really even played quarterback before. So I don't know. I always thought that was kind of a cool story too, just sort of the origins of his accuracy, which I mean might be one of his most underappreciated aspects, because people think about like the big arm and the scrambles and stuff, but like I mean he's so incredibly accurate too. So so I don't know. There's more too about sort of the family history in Texas, which I find fascinating, but I can stop talking.
Well, I was gonna say, Rustin, I think like one of the stories that jumped out to me that I had not seen before, and obviously he's been written about plenty, but this is really the first full-length book that's explored kind of all the different facets of his character and his upbringing. I love this story, which I had not heard before. Just speaking of his multi-sport prowess, where after his last high school football game, where they lost 65-60 in the playoffs, he texted his basketball coach on the bus home to ask if he could play in the basketball game the next day. Which, like, it's crazy because I mean, you kind of alluded to this with the bigger schools, the Power Five schools. I mean, they're recruiting guys to play quarterback at those schools that are, after they're getting eliminated from their high school semifinal championship round, they're going to go out and throw football the next day, probably for a scout. They're going to go do a passing camp. They're not going to be asking to play, in the high school basketball game the next day. And I thought that really spoke to, I mean, that's just you put it as, and I thought this was a great descriptor. It really is like something out of a different era of sport. It reads almost exactly like earlier in the chapter where you're describing, what Patrick Mahomes Sr. did and his father before him, excelling at all these different sports. And it's not something that I feel like we see as often, with guys that go pro. Like usually you are sort of honing in on your best sport.
No, I mean, totally. I mean, the other funny part about that, which comes up later in the book, but like Patrick, he was, like the Texas Player of the Year in his class in Texas. So he wasn't completely anonymous as a football player. But not only that, he played his senior year of football, like with a kind of a injured foot. And it's like, if you talk to his football coaches and then his basketball coach, it was kind of like a mysterious injury. Like most people thought it was maybe just sort of like an overuse thing from something happened in baseball in the summertime, and then he just never really had time to heal. So not only is he calling his basketball coach, it's like, oh, can I play in the game tomorrow? Because, the football season had gone so late into the basketball season, but he was like sort of injured at the time too. And he re-aggravated the foot like shortly thereafter. And the basketball coach is thinking like, oh man, like this guy's got a scholarship, to Texas Tech, and heck, he might still even play professional baseball. Like he's probably going to just pack it in and just like rest for the rest of the basketball season. And Patrick did not. He was like, no, I want to play. And so he basically played almost all of his senior year basketball season with an injured foot, but still was, one of the better teams. I think this is in the book, but I might have it wrong, but I think they like won their district or whatever. And he was, like one of the better players. So Anyway, that was my other favorite part of that story. But it does feel, I mean, it's funny because you're talking about the history and the childhood of this guy and this kid, and it's like, well, this is happening in like 2012,
Right.
It's not that long ago. But it does feel like something that could have been, out of 20 or 30 years ago.
Sure. So let's talk sort of about the Chiefs here. And you mentioned you obviously grew up in Kansas City, and this is one of the things that you talk about in the book. I mean, Kansas City in the 90s was very much a football town, and really the whole town, because this was before the downtown renaissance and before the latest Kansas City comeback, was defined by Marty Ball, and defined more specifically by playoff utility. And so I kind of wanted to dive into your experience as a Chiefs fan. I mean, what was it like for you as an author? Now, obviously, writing about this 25 years later, to kind of revisit, your experience as a fan in your childhood versus, I mean, the same people, the same kids that are growing up, we were 8 in 1995, right? 8-year-olds now that are Kansas City sports fans. Boy, they have it so good.
No. So I have a couple of random memories. It's weird the things you
Sure.
remember when you were from when you were a kid, but I remember being in the first grade when the Chiefs went to the AFC Championship against the Bills. And like when you're in like the first grade, and then the teacher's making like small talk at the beginning of the day about like what's going on in the world. And so she's like, like what happened this weekend, and somebody sort of like held up like a sign that said like the Chiefs are going to the Super Bowl. And of course they ended up losing to the Bills. But I remember that game. And then I remember I guess that was the same. It's weird the things that how they kind of blur together, but that was the same playoff run where they beat the Oilers. And do you guys remember this? They remember the restaurant Houston's. Like there was one at like 95th and Metcalf, and there might have been one on the Plaza.
I remember.
Yeah, there was one. Yeah, on the
yeah,
Plaza.
and I remember this that they changed the name of the restaurant for that week to like Kansas City's, I guess. I don't know. It wasn't Houston's that week. My other favorite memory that's not in the book, but that when Joe Montana was playing, you guys remember? I might have the number wrong, but remember the country music station Young Country, like 104.3 or
sure.
something?
Yeah, Young Country. Yeah.
Was it 104.3? I'm not sure.
It was high or it was low hundreds. I mean, you're right in there.
Yeah, it was Young Country, whatever. And I remember they changed the name of the station when I think they played the 49ers, maybe it was just when Joe Montana literally came to town. They changed the name of the station to Montana Country, which I always I guess at the time it's like when you're like 8 or 9, you're like, that's cool. And in retrospect, it's kind of cheesy, but yeah. And then so I don't know. I guess I had a pretty standard Chiefs fandom. It's hard to remember exactly what you thought, but like I remember, the Chiefs being on the cover of Sports Illustrated and just like assuming that like that Sports Illustrated was smart and knew what they were talking about. So it was like, oh, I guess they're going to win the Super Bowl.
Sure, we're going to win the Super Bowl. Sports Illustrated never gets any predictions wrong. So when you were writing about obviously the current Kansas City fan experience and the Patrick Mahomes era, which I was calling it that back in, really 2018, the first game as a starter, right? Week 1, 2018, like, okay, it's the Patrick Mahomes era. But now that's what it is. That's the year of the NFL we're living in. It's not just that era of Chiefs football. This is the Patrick Mahomes era. We're all living in it. What was your favorite chapter or your favorite part of that to write about?
That's a great question. I mean, I feel his first season was interesting to write about. We sort of tied in sort of the evolution of the quarterback position and kind of go back and tell the history of the basically the evolution of passing in the NFL. Like because this is rather here nor there, but it's really interesting to me that like, passing took so long. I mean, it's like sort of like analytics, but it's like, it's just so obviously the best, in most efficient, best way to, play football.
Yeah.
And yet it took decades and decades for that to happen. Anyway, so we write a little bit about that. I think I actually really enjoyed writing about Mahomes' season on the bench, in sort of his year as an apprentice to
Really interesting. Yeah.
But all of those seasons were kind of fun to write about. The Super Bowl chapter, the first Super Bowl was fun, and then we have a chapter sort of about the ankle, and tying that back into some stuff. So I don't know, they were all kind of fun to just sort of, because these were stories that people were going to know, right? So like, how do you, and there's some like, new little bits of information here or there, but it was really trying to kind of just write them in sort of a cinematic way for people to sort of just kind of relive them and enjoy them. And so, yeah, there was a funny story that this is in the book, and I don't know that, I mean, you can find this on YouTube, so it's not like we're breaking news or anything like this, but it's just really funny in retrospect that when the week that the Chiefs traded Alex Smith to Washington, Travis Kelce was at the Super Bowl, and he goes on the Dan Patrick show, and he was like kind of friends with Alex Smith, or trying to be a good teammate. And Dan's asking him about Alex Smith being traded, and Travis is like acting kind of like shocked.
Yeah.
And he's like, yeah, like, I don't know what happened, but like, I haven't talked to him yet, like what, and then Dan Patrick asks Travis Kelce, so what does Mahomes give you that Alex Smith didn't? And Travis Kelce says, he's just like, I don't know. Like, I think that remains to be seen. And like, I don't know that yet. And it's just like, I guess part of that is probably Travis Kelce, really trying to be like a good friend to Alex Smith, who I think he really liked and respected. But it really is kind of fascinating to listen to that in retrospect. I think Travis and Patrick's relationship was already starting to kind of bloom at that point, but maybe it hadn't really fully taken off yet. But it's so obvious, we sort of, if you go back and like, and again, this is well documented, but if you go back and listen to Urban Meyer, talk about Alex Smith when he was kind of young in his career, he would always just talk about how cautious he was. And it, like that Captain Checkdown, sort of reputation, it was sort of well earned. I mean, and not just with the way we saw him play in Kansas City, but kind of throughout his entire career. Like he really was, did not want to take chances. And, we talked to Brad Childress, who was, his assistant head coach during Patrick's rookie season when he wasn't playing. And, he would talk about kind of meetings where, Alex and Patrick would sort of be, kind of going back and forth over like, a play. And, Alex would say like, well, I think, based on this coverage and like how they're playing this, like, you should hit this one. And then Patrick would literally say like, well, what about this? And then he'd like point to like the deep shot, like over, like this guy's got a step and like, I think you could like hit him, like he's open. And, they'd like kind of look at the screen and they'd be like, well, yeah, he is open, but like,
I can't hit him.
Yeah. Like right. You're going to have to, put it 50 yards out there, with like not much time and like not much, to like ramp up and throw it. And I guess Alex Smith had a word for like really long throws. He would call them hucks. He'd be like, oh man, that's a huck. And so it was, like he would see things that just other people would not try. And it was not, like just because of purely like, that's kind of just like the way he thought about, the game. And Brad Childress said, like that year on the sidelines, which people have written a lot about and know a lot about, but, like Andy Reid really wanted to see Patrick Mahomes take chances. And like all of the kind of crazy throws, like, maybe Andy Reid hasn't said this publicly, but, or at least in this explicit way, but I think he really like was like, yeah, like just, like, let's see what you can do. Like, try things. He always uses the term, and, you see this on NFL films sometimes, but he always uses the term like, just keep shooting.
Yep.
And, he used to say that to Donovan McNabb too, but he's just like, just keep shooting. And I think he really I think Andy Reid really appreciated having a quarterback that, that he didn't really have to say that to. Like Patrick Mahomes he's going to keep shooting. So
yeah, Red Raiders. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Has Patrick read the book or seen a draft, or like how involved have you been directly with him about this?
No, I mean, that's a good question. So no, I mean, I know he hasn't. And we never interviewed Patrick directly one-on-one. We had some conversations with his people, and he just doesn't really do a lot of one-on-one interviews.
Sure.
So it's we had spent a lot of time with Pat Senior, and we talked to his grandfather Johnny Mahomes, who hasn't come up, but
awesome. Whose dad is that? Is that Randy's or Pat's?
No, Pat's dad. So he's we sort of get into the family history a little bit in Tyler, and so and then obviously a lot of people that he kind of grew up with, and spent not a lot of time, and I think people got to see him even more with the Netflix documentary, but talked to Bobby Stroop a little bit, and a few other people. And I went to Los Angeles, or technically Orange County, in about a year and a half ago, or almost maybe 2 years ago now, and talked to Lee Steinberg sort of about the draft process. And so, yeah, I mean, there was we did a lot of reporting, but we just never talked to Patrick. And I think I think partly why it sort of works as well is that it's not really a traditional biography. And also Patrick Mahomes I think he just turned, I mean, his birthday was recently, right? Isn't he born in July?
Yeah. Or he's coming up. He'll be like week 2 or 3.
September.
It's always right after the season starts.
Yep.
I always used to confuse him with Mondesi, because I think Mondesi was older than Patrick Mahomes.
Oh, nice.
We don't have time for Royals talk this time.
Sorry to bring him up. But anyway, he will be 28 shortly.
Yes,
is
September
my point.
17th.
So when it's like, this is a biography, and it's really kind of looking at his rise, but at the same time, people can only know so much about their, I guess I'll put it like this. It's almost unfair to ask somebody to consider their life too much at the age of 28.
Yeah.
So
yes, 100%. Yeah. You've got an event coming up for the book. Why don't you tell everybody what's going on around launch time for you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if anybody's in the Kansas City area and wants to come just have a cold beverage and hang out and celebrate the book, we're having a launch party at the Record Bar on August 16th. It's at 7:00. My friend Kevin Morby, he's like a musician. He's gonna play some songs, and we'll do kind of maybe a short Q&A or something like that. So and then there's also an event through Rainy Day Books on September 10th, which is the first Sunday of the NFL season. The Chiefs will obviously play on Thursday, but we'll do a kind of a Q&A with them at the Unity Temple on the Plaza. So that's if awesome. You just go to the Rainy Day Books website, you can find that event pretty easily too.
Well, that sounds like fun for you guys. Super appreciate your time tonight. This was fascinating. Can't wait to read the book. We'll get you out of here with this. How long is it going to continue to be Always Sunny in Chiefs Kingdom?
Until Patrick Mahomes retires.
That is perfect. Rustin, Dodd, we really appreciate it, man. You have a good night.
Thanks, guys.